Hey everybody, it's Gavin Lawrence with American Players Theater, welcoming you to the first edition of In the Wake of Our Shadow, Black Voices.
Auction. What was I wearing? I don't recall. I remember walking down a series of switchbacks away from the Italianate mansion where all of her children died. Night was entering, inching over the world horizontally from right to left, the moon's structured whiteness, an objet d'art. Then we arrived at the beautiful space filled with beautiful gold-flecked people. Everywhere strings of lights, illuminated filigree, a world webbed with stars, the feeling of bodily effervescing. No, I hadn't been to the track. I'd heard that was where squalor lived, a barely contained seediness that was allowed. I am one who has been reared to prefer the cultivated. Black tie, black men in tuxedos trailing with push brooms, sweeping up the bready droppings, the way they break apart so easily, losing their fragrance of grass and earth. Why should this veneer fail me now? Watching the crowd lean forward, smelling their hunger, the sound of the gavel falling like a cudgel on a head, and the good people rushing forward to shake the hand of the victorious. I saw our history in it, roped right there in the ring. The muscled beauty of excellence, the monocular acuity, how the breadth of the eye evolved for speed. It stood on the dais as the groom lovingly turned its best side to the light, its best side being every side, coat gleaming like blackest water. The whole room instantly aroused, the men's pants tenting, the women with their sun secretions, as happens when you are in the presence of the holiest of forms. It was looking at us with an awareness beyond time, casting its 50-foot parabolic gaze broadly over the earth. Admittedly, as my mind filled with images of heated brands and whips, I thought of Christ's last, the petals of blood licking his face. It was every being who has ever stood center stage in chains, all of us implicated simply by being there, regardless of sympathy or intent. Then I heard a voice shout 2.2 and another go higher. The most pragmatic teaching Jesus ever gave. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God's. The gavel finally falling on 2.8 million. But what if we don't know the difference? No, it wasn't just my presence that made me a participant to spectacle, which explains why I've carried this haunting ever since. He said the poor will be with us always, and I ran with it. I let it let me off the hook. Then the groom, tuxedo dark as ink, himself descended from such brutality, turned and let it out.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. That's a powerful poem. Thank you for sharing that. Amy Quan Barry, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural presentation of In the Wake of Our Shadow, Black Voices. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be your inaugural.
I'm kicking myself because I'm embarrassed to say that before we worked together this past summer, I didn't know of your work, and you have there's so much that you have done, and the breadth of your work, it's just quite amazing. And I am so inspired to kind of get back in the world of poetry and literature that I feel like I kind of stepped away from for a while. But for our audience who may not know you, if you will just allow me a brief moment to just share some biographical information about you, that would be great. So, Amy Quan Barry, known in literary circles as Quan Barry, is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she directs the Wisconsin Institute of Creative Writing. She's the author of 4 poetry collections: Asylum, Controvertibles, Water Puppets, and Loose Strife. Her poems have appeared in The New Yorker, the Missouri Review, Plowshares, the Kenyon Review, and other literary publications. She's a recipient of the Agnes Lynch Starrett Prize, as well as fellowships from Stanford University, the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing, the Wisconsin Arts Board, and the National Endowment for the Arts. She's written 2 novels, She Weeps Each Time You're Born, and most recently, We Ride Upon Sticks, about which NPR wrote, "We Ride Upon Sticks is for the kind of adults who watch Stranger Things and still have somewhere an athletic award inscribed on a paper plate." We Ride Upon Sticks was also listed in the Best Books of 2020 category by NPR and Book Riot, and as a must-read book of 2020 by Time Magazine. The Literary Hub listed it in their Our 65 Favorite Books of 2020, and it also received a shout out from Oprah Magazine, describing it as spellbinding, wickedly fun. Each sentence fizzes like a just opened bottle of new Coke. Woo.
It's new Coke, it's not classic Coke, right?
It's new Coke. There it is.
It's important to make that distinction, so yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. She also runs Asphodel, a website in which she periodically shares unpublished poetry. And here for,
right word.
Say again?
I said periodically is the right word.
And for us APT fans, she is a playwright. Her plays include The Millennium Debate, Tenebra, Among the Children Who Have Not Yet Attained Knowledge of What Lies Hidden, and Peraspera. I don't know if I said that right, but so thank you once again for being here with us. I'm so excited to just introduce you to our audience and to those who are avid fans of poetry, of complex, muscular writing that ultimately I think speaks to the human condition and finds in some way it connects us all in ways that we may not have realized we could be connected. So I would love for you to share with us just a little bit about your upbringing, your childhood, and what led you to the world of creative writing.
Yeah, so I was born in Vietnam during the American War there, and I left as an infant, so I was adopted and raised primarily on the North Shore of Boston. Having said that, though, my mom has Wisconsin ties, so my mother's parents primarily lived here in Wisconsin. So even as a kid, I would always come, and my grandparents lived up in Door County. So I have like a lot of memories of Door County. And my grandmother passed away in 2013. But before then, I would spend for the last like 30 years, I would be up in Door County every summer, you know, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all that kind of fun stuff. So I have Wisconsin ties. But growing up on the North Shore of Boston, it was a suburb, again, the town of Danvers. Which, again, if you read We Ride Upon Sticks, you learn is the place where a lot of the events happened that actually sparked the Salem witch hysteria. So again, Salem used to be much bigger back in 1692. And then the part of Salem that was called Old Salem Village, or was called Salem Village, is where a lot of the stuff happened that made the witch trials. And then that part broke off and became the town of Danvers. And that's where I was actually raised. So when I was growing up there in the 1980s, it was predominantly white, like 95% white. But having said that, as a kid, the way I started writing and getting into writing was, I don't think as a child I realized that I recognized that there were already holes in like literature and things that I wanted to fill. So I remember like a librarian, at some reading club suggesting that I read this book called Philip Larkin Likes Me, I Reckon Maybe. And it was the first book I read, in which was about a young Black girl living in the South and like all her adventures. And I remember reading that being like, yeah, wow, And as a kid, I was always writing stuff, drawing stuff, all those kinds of fun things. And then when I went away to college in the South, I began to realize that there were holes, that there were when I was coming up, I mean, there were Black poets and Black writers, but just not that many. And so I was fortunate to take a class, for example, with Rita Dove, who's the former poet laureate in the United States, and a few other folks. And I just began to think that there should be work being written by somebody like me. You know what I mean? So I have this really complicated background in certain ways because, you know, I'm biracial, I'm half Asian, half Black, and yet I was raised in a predominantly white community. And so I recognize that I have different perspectives on things from other people. And I was just like, where's my perspective? You know, when I look out and I see what's going on in this world, I just thought there should be people like me, or there should be all kinds of people, but I would be interested in figuring out like what kinds of things somebody like me would write. And so that still fuels me even to today. You know, I'm always interested in telling stories, again, where I identify a whole. So for example, my first novel is set in Vietnam. And basically there are so many stories that we get about Vietnam are told from the point of view of American soldiers who were there in the 1970s. And so I wanted to write a book that specifically was about a Vietnamese woman's perspective of Vietnam as a country and not just about the war. And then lastly, I would say that my novel, We Write Upon Sticks, follows a girls' team of field hockey players as they try and make it to the state championship. And there, I recognize that when it comes to women's sports, we rarely see them represented in novels. Usually novels or in TV or in movies, it's football, it's basketball. If you do see women's sports, it's things like ice skating or gymnastics. And I wanted to very specifically to look at women's team sports. And so that's why I wrote that novel. So again, just in wrap up, I think a lot of my career has been about this idea of identifying like wholes. So for example, you mentioned the play, which you were in and which you will be in for Forward Theater in spring 22, little plug there. Yes, hoping everything goes well. So when thinking about that play, you know, it follows like upper class African-American people, right? And so it's true that at least for me, when I'm reading, you know, I know those folks are in the theater, but not in the ways that I had necessarily, they don't have a lot of visibility, like upper class Black folks in theater, right? And so I was just interested in writing a play that had upper class Black folks as characters. So that's a long answer to your question, but yeah.
And so it was your curiosity and your need to kind of fill those holes that led you to taking up the mantle as a writer?
I think in general, I've always been, because for me, I'm actually interested to see what I'll write, right? So to me, it is a discovery process, and I'm interested to see like, well, what's on my mind? What am I thinking about? So I don't think I consciously, when I began writing, and even now, I don't think I consciously was like, I see these holes and I'm going to write into them. But I definitely recognize that there were just certain voices that weren't there. And so I just thought to myself, well, what might I end up producing? And so that's primarily what motivates me.
I was reading that you tend not to write about yourself in most of your stuff. But in reading She Weeps Each Time You're Born, which seems at times at least partially autobiographical, just about your connection to Vietnam, I was noticing near the end of the novel, there's a character that's introduced who is darker than the other folks. Is that somehow symbolic of you and your connection to that world, or?
So it's true that I tend not to write about myself. And thinking about in my fiction, so in She Weeps Each Time You're Born, there is actually a character named Amy Quan. There's a character, but you only see Amy Quan in the very beginning, first 3 pages, and at the very, very end, last couple of pages. And she might not be referred to as Amy Quan. The only reason I include is that character, you know, is it me, is it not me? Because I see that book as being a ghost story in certain kinds of ways. It's about, the book is about someone who's born in Vietnam who has the ability to hear the voices of the dead. And so you follow their life and the various things that happen to them. And so because I see it as being a ghost story, it was important to me. I thought that if I had a character named Amy Quan in it, that it kind of plays with this whole idea of like, well, is this true or is this not true? You know what I mean? So that's what I was trying to do in that particular piece. It wasn't the idea of but I suppose you could think of it a little bit as working as, you know, the way that Alfred Hitchcock would, you know, insert himself, like he'd be going around, right? So it could be like my little Alfred Hitchcock moment where it's like.
I loved it. So. I loved it. Like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up at the end there in an interesting way. I really loved that novel. Thank you for that. You mentioned somewhere that you consider yourself an amateur classicist. I
Yes.
was just wondering, since we at American Players, we are constantly, and even more so recently, uh, just kind of grappling with what that term means. What is classical writing? Who decides what it is? Whose definition do we use? Can you speak a little bit about your connection to the classical world?
Mhm. So as a child, my mother made many of us take Latin. So I had to take Latin growing up. So I took a lot of Latin growing up. I took Latin in grad school, like Latin has followed me everywhere. And then as an adult, as a professor, I decided to take ancient Greek. And I only managed a year of ancient Greek. And it really, I couldn't believe how hard it was. And I got to kick my butt. And so I've always just been interested in these stories. And I've expanded my depth of what I think of as classical. We tend to think of it as only Western, like Western Civ, but then, there's a classical tradition, obviously in India, thinking about Sanskrit, you have classical traditions in Africa. When you think about like Ethiopia and how, like Coptic and things like that, right? So in some ways, we're also talking about like Orthodox, right? And so I've really expanded my notions of what I think of as being classical. I think, so your question is about like who decides, right? So when it comes to literature, when we think in terms of, we don't use the word classical as much, we use the word like canonical. People talk about like canonical texts and what that means, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the importance of bringing more people into the academy and more people into these spaces, because when you do that, it expands the definition of what these things are. I think a good analogy is if you think about what's happening with the Academy of American Pictures. So, think about the Oscars, right? So they were trying to include more people as being Academy members so that when they vote, they're more inclusive in certain kinds of ways, right? It is true that in thinking about this broadening of, what is or isn't, I was thinking about it, for example, with respect to even like, what wins what kinds of awards, right? So you think about like Kendrick Lamar, like winning the Pulitzer Prize, right? Which for a lot of people are like, why? Because usually that goes to a classical, musician in certain kinds of ways, right? And so it's like, yeah, why can't that be, a Pulitzer Prize winning text as well? You think about Amanda Gorman recently reading her poem at the inauguration, and that spoken word. Traditionally, it's true that before her, I think there were only 3 poets who ever read at an inauguration. There was Robert Frost way back in the day. There was Miller Williams, there was Elizabeth Alexander, and Richard Blanco, so 4. But again, they were much more like, quote unquote, I would say like academic poets or poets of the academy in certain kinds of ways. And so to bring in a young, spoken word poet, again, just shows people what's possible. And again, it expands those boundaries, right? And then the last thing I would say about it is the British writer Martin Amis, who I super love, although he's got his issues. He's definitely a man of his time. But I remember him a long time ago talking about why he was always interested in American literature versus British literature and just what's going on here. And he made the comment that in America, this is where language is getting cooked. Like that's the word that he would use, like getting cooked, right? And it's because it's our strength as a multicultural society that language is always cooking here in a certain kind of way, like even in thinking about the idea that, how oftentimes you have Black creators now who come up with terms and then a week later, like suburban moms are using those same terms, or what have you. Or you think about it in terms of like dances, again, Black dancers who are putting certain dances on TikTok and then, within a week or two, like everybody's doing these, right? And so there's a way in which we have this cooking of cultures here, this cooking of language. And again, I think that expands what we think of them than when we think in terms of like classical or canonical spaces.
I hear you. Did Maya Angelou read at Obama's? Did she?
She might. You're right. So Clinton had 2. Clinton had Miller Williams, and he had Maya Angelou.
And then it was Clinton. Yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that, which I actually don't agree with, I actually think that because we have a national poet laureate, I actually think the national poet laureate should be the person who reads at the inauguration, and that Republicans and Democrats, because historically it's only been Democrats who've had a poet read at their inaugurations, but I feel like poetry should be big enough so whoever the national poet laureate is, should be able to write a poem for like all of us, and perform it, as opposed to having it just be like a partisan thing where Democrats have poets read at their inauguration and Republicans don't, like maybe be a little bit bigger than that. So
right. It's interesting. My connection to like Greek literature or Greek philosophy, it wasn't a fun one growing up because I went to a junior high school in DC in which our ancient history teacher was not very kind to me. And she contributed to my actually my desire to find, I guess, African connections or other connections to what Western culture considers classical. And we seem to like credit the Greeks with so much of what we've come to know, or at least Western culture, as you were saying earlier. Have you found in your journey specific connections between Greek philosophy, Greek mythology, to say Northern Africa, ancient Egypt? I know there's a book called Stolen Legacy by George James, in which he kind of chronicles how Alexander the so-called Great and the Greeks studied at the ancient mystery schools of Egypt. And have you found any information connected to that in your journey at all?
You know, there's tons of that kind of, I couldn't point you to any one thing, but there's such a, you know, I think even in the Middle East too, right? So it's the idea that all of these ideas, all, you know, so obviously in thinking about Africa, you definitely have Northern Africa. I mean, the Romans, they had, you know, like, so Dido and Aeneas. Dido is, you know, she's an African queen, right? And so again, you know, it's Northern Africa. So there's all, you know, they're always talking about like the Ethiopians, you know, in certain kinds of ways, you know, in Greece and Rome, and, you know, talking about like, maybe if there's like a triumphal procession, they'll talk about the Ethiopians have brought us, you know, whatever it is that they've brought, right? So, so yeah, there's all kinds of ways in which those worlds mixed much more than most people are familiar with. You know, the book that I'm working on right now is actually set in Mongolia, and Mongolia used to be in the 13th century-ish. You know, it was Genghis Khan, depending on how you pronounce it. You know, it was the center of the world. And so you had people from all over, from Europe coming, from Africa coming, from the Middle East coming. And it's really where ideas really mixed and all those kinds of things. So yes, there's just so much of that, but you're right. Like, we just, unfortunately, especially when we studied it in high school, especially back in the day, it's now we're getting more, but you know, those kinds of things were not taught to us, you know, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear you. And I feel that for me, I was lucky to kind of grow up on the campus of Howard University. My mother was a professor there, and I went to school there. So, you know, we were always connected and exposed to our contributions to what at times other cultures have claimed. I found it so interesting the first time I heard about in the story of the Immaculate Conception being told in the pyramids, in the hieroglyphics, with Osiris and Horus and Isis, you know, mating with a hawk and all of that kind of stuff, just making those connections. And I know other cultures have their their stories too. So yeah. Talk to me a little bit, if you can, about your foray into the world of playwriting. And I saw that you had mentioned that you tend to feel when you're done with something that it's finished, you know, that whereas, as you know, us theater people, we collaborate and we go through with we cut and we fix, and I just am interested into hearing how you're kind of navigating a world that is very different from the one you've lived as a poet and novelist.
Yeah. Yes. So I started writing plays, I think maybe in 2011. It was a while ago. I don't know why. I decided I'm going to write some plays. It's kind of the same thing too. Like when I started to write fiction, generally speaking, although this is changing in academia, I think particularly with the younger generation, when I was coming up, like in the 1990s, late 90s, people tended to do one thing. Like, you were a poet, you were a fiction writer, you were a playwright. There really wasn't a lot of bleed through in certain kinds of ways, right? That's changing now. Now more and more you have folks a lot of people write essays, you know, they do this or they do that. So for whatever reason, I decided that I wanted to write plays. So I don't know, I go to plays, but I didn't know anything else about them. And so I sat down one winter, like in 2011, and just read a ton of contemporary plays, and then wrote a play. And then I wrote another play, and then I put them in a drawer, and I just kind of walked away from them because I knew that it would take it takes a lot more than just me and an editor, right? I'm like, you know, you need people who have money who believe in it, and you need that. But various things lined up, you know, in various ways. And obviously now I'm at the beginning of potentially this, you know, playwriting path. And so you're right. It is true that I'm learning how to navigate this this collaborative space. In many ways, like that's the strength of the space, is that it is collaborative, right? And so you get other ideas, things that you hadn't thought about, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I also think there's probably ways in which play stuff could evolve. I think there are probably certain ways in which they're kind of like old, I don't want to say old fashioned, but things that have served the theater obviously very well for all these years, right? But I also think that there could be ways in which innovation, you know, with respect to new work could happen. You know, the idea, what am I talking about? But like, I don't know. For me, I think it's the thing that people are most shocked about. And then I'll move off this question because I'm not answering it very well. But I think it's for me, I am happy with whatever happens to something. You know what I mean? So for example, when I write a novel and I send it to my editor and she says yes or no, and it gets, you know, and then it's like, I do have a say in, you know, cover and those kinds of things. But then for me, once it's out in the world, I really just let it go. You know, you had mentioned at the opening that you said you were embarrassed that you hadn't heard of, you know, me and my work and whatever. It's true. Like, I'm not a hustler. And I don't say that in a bad way for people who are out there hustling. You know, I think a lot of writers, you have to hustle. You have to be on Instagram. You got to be on Twitter. You got to have your name out there. You got to be part of the conversation constantly. I have no interest in that at all. I just don't. And I have that same kind of attitude when it comes to playwriting. Like, I just want to write this play. I want to send it to somebody and be like, hey, what you do with it is, you know, what you come up with. Cool. You know, maybe I'll like it, maybe I won't. It doesn't really matter to me, you know, but people want me to be in that space and to help them think through things. And I understand why, but I'm like, I'm giving you the keys, like, do what you want. Like, so that is something that I'm figuring out, you know, how to be like, I'm perfectly fine, let it go. I'm letting you all just do what you need, and just figuring out like how much I do need to be present or don't need to be present. So really, it sounds like I'm whining because these are amazing opportunities for me. So at the end of the day, I'm completely grateful for everything that's happening. So I don't want people to think that I'm not.
But when you say do what you want after having given your play to a theater, you're speaking about them in terms of their production values, how they choose to stage it. Not, can you not change this word here or change this line or invert this that kind of stuff? Or
This wouldn't bother me. I mean, it's true. It would bother me, for example, in thinking about the Mendelian debate, if suddenly people decide they were going to cast that with a white cast. Like, yes, that would be problematic for me, right? But other kinds of things like smoothing out or what have you, because at the end of the day, for me, like, the beautiful thing about the play is that there is like an interactive element to it. There is an improvisational aspect to it, right? I remember a friend of mine, and it was a reading that she was having. So it was just a reading of her work. And I remember her, because she was a playwright, and she was sitting there and cringing because she's like, oh, they dropped a line. Oh, you know? And for me in the audience, it's like, it would have been one thing if you were an audience member and thinking, wow, this feels really herky jerky, or this isn't working, but it was working. And so to me, like, if it works, I don't have issues with that. Now it's true, like if the work needs work, like if it's weak, you know, that I definitely appreciate people giving me feedback and being like, yes, this character is underdeveloped and you need to do X, Y, or Z, and those kinds of things. So yes, I don't want to say just, oh, I'm above revision and it's beneath me. So I'm not saying that. Yeah, but I do think that I was kind of surprised. Again, obviously we worked together just a little bit, but I think in my mind, I maybe had a TV version of what that's supposed to look like. And in the TV version of it, it's the idea that the actor is the one making all those decisions. Like, well, here, am I thinking about my dog or am I thinking about my key? Whatever you want works for me. But I was surprised at how much people turned to me for those answers. And I don't say it like in a mean, dismissive way when I say that. I'm like, I'm actually much more interested to see what you all come up with. Like, I'm not as interested in like if it's thinking about a dog or thinking about whatever. I'm like, make it work. You know what I mean? So I think that's where my attitude about this kind of is coming from.
it's interesting because I can say that I've been on both sides of this kind of predicament as an actor. You know, for the most part, especially working at a theater that primarily does quote unquote classical work, our playwrights are dead, right? And having a playwright in the room with you developing a new play can help you answer some things that you may otherwise feel you're guessing at. At the same time, as someone who has also written some plays, what I have learned, going back to this whole idea of collaboration, sometimes I feel like there are too many cooks in the kitchen, right? But I also have been told, and I think some of those folks were right, that for me as a writer, you want to try to make, at least I try to make my play as director proof and as actor proof as possible, meaning that, not that I don't want their input and what they bring to the table, but I don't want what they bring to the table to change what the play is about. So I hear you. I hear you about, because I have a friend who's a playwright, an amazing playwright, Carlisle Brown, and we've worked together a lot. And so I will say to him in rehearsal, Carlisle, what is this? And he's like, I say, why does he go the cliche? Why do I move over here? What is that about? And he's like, you're the actor, man. It's not my job. Yeah. I was like, okay. Yeah. I got you. You have also mentioned that as you write, it's more intuitive, but you also say that you have your title, your epigraph, or, specific things that you map out ahead of time. Can you share a little bit of how you kind of marry those two?
Yeah. So even thinking about having my title or my epigraph. So basically what I'm describing there is like, I go chronologically the way the book is. I have my title, We Ride Upon Sticks. The epigraph is Ann Putnam, 1706. The first chapter is called Danvers versus Masconomet. The first line is halfway through the second half, but it's like that tends to be how I work. I don't tend to plot things out. It's like some people they have outlines, they have ideas, they plot things out. So I tend not to do that. I tend to just write, see what happens. And then, it's interesting because in playwriting and in fiction, the idea of revision, after I have a draft, then I can go back in and be like, oh, okay. I hadn't really realized when I was writing it that the connection that this person was going to be connected 5 chapters later to this person. And so I need to pump up the breadcrumbs so that when we get there, it's been supported, right? In poetry, not so much. In poetry, I can basically work a poem for X number of days, and get it to where I want it to be. But when it comes to fiction and playwriting, I got to write it, and then I can go back and add in all those other kinds of things. And there's a lot more work in revision, obviously, in a play and in fiction. I would say, though, I recently wrote a screenplay, which was a first. I've never, So if anybody knows Viola Davis, I wrote a comedy because I watched like Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which she, of course, is totally amazing in. But I watched it and I thought, no, but she needs a comedy. So it's the way that people say, this is maybe, I don't mean it to be insulting, but the idea that she's like the Black Meryl Streep. I'm like, Meryl Streep is allowed to be in Mamma Mia. But for whatever reason, like Viola Davis is not allowed to be in Mamma Mia, right? And so I'm like, she needs a comedy. So I wrote her a comedy, which I see it tonally, not as far as the narrative. The tone to me is a cross between Anchorman and Something About Mary. Like it's this kind of, it's not a gross out comedy, it's like, it's a pretty crazy comedy. But anyway, but it's true that when I started writing it, I thought, I've written a play, how hard could it be to write a screenplay? And I was very quickly like, wow, what is going on? But then I talked to a screenplay agent who knows what's going to happen with it. But he was just telling me about, because I know about 3 acts, but then he said for film, there's something very specific called like an 8 sequence, 8 sequences. And once I knew what the 8 sequence, how that works and how that spans 3 acts, then it really made it so much easier to write this screenplay. So it is true, the screenplay though, it was much more plotted out. Like I had general ideas of scenes and how we needed to go places. So with that, I really needed to plot that up because you do have to hit certain time markers. Like you're gonna hit this by minute 15, you're gonna hit this by minute whatever, so that was much more. Actually, my dining room table still has like all these index cards on it and like, moved around, but that's not usually how I work when it comes to fiction or it comes to poetry. So.
Do you ever write yourself into a corner?
Yeah, that's what I like. And it's also true that it hasn't happened. Well, maybe it happens in one play that I've written. In my fiction, I always have one magical element. So in the first novel, it's the idea that she can hear the voices of the dead. In the second novel, it's the idea that maybe they have this collective mindset, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm not saying that I use the magical element to get me out of tough spots, but I almost think of it as like a fourth level. Like you have regular 3D world, and then if you add a magical element, it gives you one more realm in which to play. And so in thinking about that, it just allows me to do just more. So yeah.
What do you feel, if you have any specific, I guess, thoughts about the role of an artist in, well, in our world, in our society, in the contemporary world? Do you have a thought on what we should be doing, or folks who consider themselves artists?
So the word poem comes from the Greek, right? So it's poieo is the verb, and it literally just means to make. And so a poet is a maker. Like that's all they are at the end of the day, right? And so, you know, I'm always telling my students when we would talk about it, you don't say that Michael Jordan is an essayist in motion. It's like Michael Jordan's a poet in motion, you know what I mean? Or when you compare something, you compare it to a poem, right? You're not comparing it to like fiction. You compare, there's something about poetry, right? And so if you just think of us as just being makers, like all of us, I think in certain ways you could argue that everybody's a poet in some way, shape, or form. As far as the question of like what our job is here to do. So former poet laureate Robert Pinsky, he was talking specifically about poetry, but I think you can extrapolate and go bigger with it. And he said that the poet has a couple of responsibilities. So their first responsibility is to carry on the tradition. So if there weren't poets, poetry would disappear. So you need people to carry on a tradition. And then he said their second responsibility is to keep innovating the tradition, because if they don't innovate, then it molders and, you know, it doesn't move forward, right? And so I think that those in thinking about the idea of the role of the artist on the most basic level, it's again to carry on whatever the tradition is that they're working in, and then B, it's to innovate that tradition so that it doesn't like molder and die. And then I do think though that in many ways, and it's not for all artists. Not all artists have, you know, a calling to somehow represent, you know, to be the eye for future generations about what was happening in their time. But it's true that like historians, I remember I was at this conference once and there was a historian on the panel and we were talking about how we worked so differently. The historian was talking about how when they're doing research, like they look for a topic in which they know that they'll be able to find like a lot of information, right? And I was saying that oftentimes I look for a topic in which there won't be that much information so I can fill in the holes, right? Because I'm interested in imagining like, well, okay, there's not that much info and that it gives me that space to do that, right? And so sometimes like historians and other people talk about this idea that if you really want to know what was going on during a particular time, like you look to the art will tell you, you know? And so you can even think like in the 1950s from what I hear, right? So it's the idea, like if you look at the movies were all, there was maybe a fear of like atomic, you know, there's all these like atomic things that were happening in movies. Mm-hmm. You've Godzilla, the Blob, or whatever. It was fear of the atom bomb, right? Or what have you. So I do think there's a way in which artists, you know, can be the vehicle to tell future generations the truth about a particular moment in whatever way, shape, or form that means to them individually.
I hear you. So I was going to, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Actually, I was going to close with another poem of yours. I want to read that poem, but I don't want to close with that because there are a couple other things I want to ask you, but I would love to share some more of your work right now, if that's okay with you, with our viewers, listeners, audience. This poem, and you know, me being who I am, and I'm sure for many of us, it's a bit of a stressful time right now. I lived in Minneapolis for 19 years. My kids grew up there. My daughter still lives there. And with everything going on, I feel your poem, it's called Emmett Till's Open Casket as La Pietà, is more than timely. So if I could just share that, I would love to. Emmett Till's Open Casket as La Pietà. Today on the radio, news of the great lady's death. I think of her breaking the coroner's seals, prying her way into him. How 1,000 miles away she heard him crying in the Mississippi night, calling her name. And when the second Black man ever stood up in court, he said as much. This is the litany of injuries, the body waterlogged, monstrous, one eye gouged out, hanging halfway down his cheek, the nose broken and mostly missing, a hole in the side of his crushed head where the light came through, and the marks where they tied the fan with barbed wire to his neck, because the child wouldn't beg for his life. Let them see what I saw. And we came. For 3 straight days, we came and looked at her only son. They're beating him in the barn. When Mary holds the dead Christ in her arms, she has seen everything but the resurrection. I don't know if you ever, because I know some artists, some poets don't ever want to explain their work or feel the need to. They want people to just get from it whatever they get. Can you tell us where that came from or why you wrote it?
Happily, I am a member of, NPR. So I mean, in the sense that I donate a lot of money to them, because like so many of my poetry ideas come from NPR. It's not like there was one of my books. I'm like, oh my God, almost every idea here came from a story on NPR. So yeah, I have a memory. I was actually living in Indiana at the time, I think. I think it was roughly, yeah. So Emmett Till's mom died. And I just remember hearing that story about her dying. And thinking about, because I'm not saying that there should be, but, like many poems written about Emmett Till, and then thinking about, the poem about Emmett Till's mother, right? And then it became, so often when I sit down, I want to write a poem. And it was just this acknowledgement that she is Mary, right? So the Le Pietà, which is a very famous, it's one of my favorite. I'm not often, I wish I could say the last time I was in Rome, but the few times I'm there, I always go to the Vatican because it's Michelangelo's, and so it's Mary holding the dead Christ in her arms. And it's a really famous one because now it's behind bulletproof glass because somebody, I think in the 1980s, tried to smash it. It's just this, and just her face, the carving of her, it's a very classical, quote unquote, Italian classical face,
right.
But I've always been fascinated by that statue. And so again, hearing about her death and just thinking about her as Mary, and Emmett Till as Christ figure, it just became evident to me that was like going to be the structure for this particular poem. And so.
Wow. It's a beautiful poem. It's a powerful, it just, as in just someone who, my mother, one of the first poems I recited as a kid in school was a poem about Emmett Till that my mother had given to me to read. So thank you for that. So before we close, I know we've taken longer than I thought we would, but there's just so much to cover with you and so much that we haven't covered. Is there anything else you would like to share or communicate with me in terms of where you are at this point in your life as an artist, hopes that you have, dreams that you have?
It's interesting. So I've only learned, because again, I'm new in this playwriting world, and it was pointed out to me recently that the state of Wisconsin has so few working Black directors living here in the state that it's, in some ways it's shocking, and in other ways it's not, right? Mm-hmm. And so hearing that, it makes me really want to write more work specifically featuring Black characters. It's true, again, because I'm biracial, my novels historically, have been set. My next novel, which will be out next year, is actually set in Mongolia. So I've kind of been writing much more in Asia, in Asian characters and things like that. But for whatever, I mean, who's never say never, but now it makes me want to use my playwriting world to explore the lives of Black characters more. So knowing that, that's something that I'm really interested in, and just thinking about ways to support, Black actors in Wisconsin and beyond, Black folks in the theater, et cetera, et cetera. So I do realize that in some ways it starts with the work, right? If you don't have work that features Black characters, then, there's just not gonna be as many parts for Black actors. There's not gonna be as many, Black directors, what have you. And so it's like, okay, you got to write the work so that it's like, what is it? Field of Dreams, if you build it,
they will come.
Yeah. It's that kind of thing. So I realized, okay, that's part of my job, is to build this part of it, and to hope then that things come. So.
I love that you used the Field of Dreams reference, because I've referred to American Players Theater many times with that. If you build it, they will come. There is something extremely mystical and magical about this space and this place that I had no idea existed until I actually entered into it. So I am very, very fortunate to be connected to this theater, and now even more fortunate to have found you. Well, I am prayerful that we will get to a place where we can do the Middle-Indian debate. I'm really interested in seeing how that play lands in an audience's lap. If you don't mind, I would love to read what you wrote on your website about who you are. I just have to say I just asked you, as an artist, what is it that you think you should do? What do artists do? What are our responsibilities? But on your website, you write something, and I would love to share it if that's okay with you. I hope I don't embarrass you.
I honestly do not know what you're about to read.
Okay, great.
That's why I mentioned in the beginning that I said it was periodic. There's things there, and so I'm like, I do not remember.
So you say, I am pro-living because I believe in the heart. I believe we are all interconnected, webs within webs within webs. Each moment of intersection, jeweled and shining, sacred. I believe in the oak, the wonder of its green canopy here on earth. I believe in the body's intelligence. I believe I know what's best for me. I believe in community. I believe in strengthening the human family, which means caring for mothers and children whose birthright includes healthcare, daycare, food security, body dignity, clean air, pristine waters, education, adults who make a living wage. I believe in cultural vibrancy. I do not believe in darkness or in shame. I believe there is a difference between life and true embodied living. I have faith in individual agency as guided by our inner light and or our gods. I believe in empowering the living to thrive. I believe the only absolute is love. Wow.
It's really interesting because that's now it makes me want to go back and work on those in a good way. I want to start writing some poems that I see as being very overtly political. So for example, I don't think I've posted it, but I have one about gun violence. And so I kind of see these as like little poems again, in which I feel it can be read in many different ways. And I'd written a couple of them, and then because I have my fingers in so many pies, I kind of stepped away. But hearing you read it, I'm like, yeah, all right. I need to go back and like write some more of those. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. I read that and it just stopped me in my tracks. It just wells up so much in my spirit. And I feel it's they're words that we could all do well to live by. Yeah. So I will, on that note, thank you once again for spending some time with us on this Good Friday afternoon. Not that when it's shown to our audience, it will be Good Friday, but Thank you so much, Amy Quan Barry. It's been a pleasure and honor, and hopefully we will collaborate again sometime soon.
Hey, fabulous. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.